Everybody, to the Future Security Initiative Fall Speaker Series for the fall semester of 2025-2026 academic year. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really thrilled today to have David Scheffer, one of our faculty who teaches a number of classes in the MA in Global Security and also the IAL Master's Program. For those not familiar, the Future Security Initiative is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. We focus on security, global security, in a very kind of holistic and broad-based way with educational programs, with research projects, and then with outreach such as this event tonight. Tonight's talk by Professor Scheffer is co-sponsored by the Center for Law and Global Affairs at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law here at ASU. So we're really thrilled to be working with them. David Scheffer is a professor of practice in the Future Security Initiative and in Leadership, Democracy, and National Security Lab at Arizona State University. He's also a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the first U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes and the former director of the Center for International Human Rights and a professor at the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. He's the author of many, many articles and a number of books, including The Sit Room, in the Theater of War and Peace, and also his latest book, the UN Charter, 5 Pillars for Humankind. And that's what Professor Scheffer is going to be talking about today. He's going to give a short presentation, and then we'll have a conversation, and we'll go to Q&A from all of you. Please just drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom chat. So thank you so much. Welcome, David, and we're really thrilled to hear what you have to say tonight.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be part of the Future Security Initiative Fall Speaker Series. And I want to thank Dr. Daniel Rothenberg, for that kind introduction. And of course, also the Center for Law and Global Affairs, led by Dr. Andrea Cayley at the law school, where I'm actually also a faculty associate. The predicate for my talk today is the book that I co-authored with Dr. Mark Ellis. I'm just going to show it to you here. There it is. Dr. Mark Ellis is the executive director of the International Bar Association, headquartered in London. The book was published in late July, and as Dr. Rothenberg said, it's entitled The UN Charter, 5 Pillars for Humankind. Almost exactly 2 years ago, Mark and I were having coffee together in his London offices, and we noted that the 80th anniversary of the UN Charter and of the United Nations itself was fast approaching in 2025. On June 26, 1945, in San Francisco, the UN Charter was signed by almost 50 countries. And on October 24th of 1945, it entered into force. So bingo, 2025 is the 80th anniversary of the whole show. But we noted to each other that there really is very little modern exposure to or understanding of the UN Charter by particularly younger generations. And I know in the audience today, I probably have a mix of, well, some faculty members, I hope a lot of students, people outside of the university community who have come into this discussion with us today as well. So I think some of you probably know a fair amount about the UN Charter, and some of you probably haven't opened its pages at all in your lifetimes, or perhaps just once or twice years ago. So Mark Ellis and I, we decided to write this book to reintroduce the UN Charter 80 years on and explore some modern interpretations of its provisions. And I just want to note, particularly if any of you are teachers out there, that on the Council on Foreign Relations Education Global Matters site now, on the web, we have a book guide for the book. The book is being featured by the Council, and this book guide is available for teachers to use with students for free. So feel free to look into that if you think it might be useful. I do come to this with a personal history with the United Nations, which probably I should tell you about very briefly. It started really in the 1980s when I would write the law chapter every year for the Foreign Policy Association annual report on UN affairs, which would then be circulated in September of each year to all of the delegations of countries at the UN to sort of update them on where are various issues at the UN that year and what's going to come up in the following year. And so that got me sort of deeply embedded in, what's the update on the UN these days. But then, of course, for the 8 years of the Clinton administration, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Madeleine Albright, first while she was permanent representative to the UN, and then as Secretary of State. And the UN was part of all of those 8 years, as just constantly part of our work. And then I had a 2-year stint with the UN Association of the USA after the Clinton administration as the senior vice president, going all over the country, speaking about the UN to, Lions Club, Rotary Club, you name it. And of course, the Model UN program. And then my final exposure to the UN was for 6 years, from 2012 to 2018, as the Secretary General's special expert on UN assistance to the Khmer Rouge trials taking place in Phnom Penh. And that required raising a lot of money each year for that court, as well as reporting to the Secretary General on the progress of that court. So in any event, and then finally, of course, as a professor teaching UN law in law schools. So I come at this with some passion. It's personal to me to be writing about the UN Charter. This is about 20 years old, my copy of it. It's stapled and everything. I can't imagine buying a new copy of the UN Charter. So what I want to just get across very quickly here, and then let's go to questions, is that the UN Charter is the most important secular document in the world, period. It's the normative backbone of the United Nations, the document that binds all 193 countries that are member states of the United Nations. It is the law of the United States as a treaty. So its words, of course, sometimes seem to survive on life support these days. But I think it's important that we look at those words again, which is what the book seeks to do, and sort of dissect, well, wait a minute, what is this charter really saying to us 80 years later? Because the charter was written at a particular point in time, right at the close of World War II, and much has happened since then. There is much to criticize the United Nations about, but that is not what the book focuses on. It is about the document underpinning the United Nations, namely the UN Charter. And by the way, if you want to talk about dysfunctionality in governance, I would suggest the United Nations is not where I would start these days. But let me say up front that UN personnel are on the front lines of the most challenging and existential situations in the world: war, peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, medical aid, food assistance, peacemaking, massive migrations, the fate of children, economic development. And what UN staff do every single day is they try to coordinate among many countries and parties, and they seek solutions without being crippled by nationalist ambitions. So I think we need to recognize and frankly honor what UN staff are accomplishing on the front lines of and risking every day on the front lines of human endeavor. Now, I want to read 4 sentences from the foreword to the book, which is by Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, chairman of the Elders, which Nelson Mandela, Kofi Annan, et cetera, used to also be part of when they were with us. She wrote this in the foreword to the book. The UN Charter establishes for the ages both aspirational goals and institutional means, particularly through the United Nations and its specialized agencies, to achieve them. The fact that the UN Charter is sometimes overshadowed in the chaos of daily policymaking across the world, or challenged by skeptics questioning its relevance, does not diminish its significance. wise leaders ultimately turned to the Charter to reinforce the credibility and legitimacy of their actions. In a sense, the Charter is the great leveler among nations, reminding each one that there are common principles and procedures to honor in the pursuit of national interests amidst the constellation of factors shaping a multilateral world. Now, let me just briefly say that in the book, we have an opening introductory chapter, as well as some additional kind of historical content in the next chapter following the introduction. That does bring the reader, particularly the younger reader, the one who has just never kind of touched or thought about the UN Charter, where did this document come from? How did it emerge? And of course, the story is basically about World War II and the fact that while the fighting was taking place in World War II, there was actually a tremendous amount of prep work to create the document, the UN Charter, and then the institution, the United Nations, upon the almost precise closing of the war. They didn't know when it would end, but they had the foresight, and this was basically led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president of the United States, the foresight to say, what are we doing after the war? Because we're going to win this war, but what do we do once we win it? It's the kind of thinking that, one would hope could actually be applied a little more often with our own leaders, in the sense of, if you break the cookie jar, you own it. That was Colin Powell's mantra. And you got to know what to do afterwards to put it together. So in any event, there were all of these sessions in Newfoundland with Churchill and Roosevelt, even before the United States got into the war. The Atlantic Charter, created from that meeting, was actually the initial template for the UN Charter. Then you had meetings of the leaders of the big powers, the Allied powers, in Moscow, in Tehran, in Yalta, through those years. And at all of those meetings, it was essentially, and by the way, the United Nations as a term was created at the beginning of the war. The United Nations were all of the nations who opposed the Axis powers. They called themselves the United Nations. So the United Nations during the war was often reminded, we've got to get this job done, so that it happens at the end of the war. And the story or the meeting that took place at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., between August and October 1944, right in the middle of some of the most intense fighting of the war, it was all about what to do after the war. And the first draft of the UN Charter really emerged from Dumbarton Oaks, and it was called the Dumbarton Oaks Proposals. And I just want to quickly say that Franklin Roosevelt, being the politician that he was, he decided that he had to get the American public on board with what would be the United Nations. So he orchestrated a vast national campaign in late 1944, early 1945, where the Dumbarton Oaks proposals were the subject of town hall meetings across the country, so that the people of America would be introduced to this concept. Well, the Dumbarton Oaks proposals morphed into the UN Charter drafting in San Francisco, April to June of 1945. But by then, the American public was pretty familiar with what this was all about in San Francisco, because they had been prepped and briefed on the Dumbarton Oaks proposals. Thus, shooting far forward that summer, once the UN Charter was put to bed and drafted, and the signing took place on June 26th of 1945, it took only 1 month for President Harry S. Truman, who had been a champion of the UN issues in the Senate ever since 1943. It took him 1 month to introduce the UN Charter to the US Senate and to get it approved in the US, ratified in the US Senate in late July of 1945 by a vote of 89-2. And so that was sort of a masterstroke of consensus building that Roosevelt had initiated. I want to just shoot forward now and mention that the future of the charter most likely will not, I repeat, will not reflect modernizing amendments approved by a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly and then ratified nationally by 2/3 of the members of the United Nations. The prospect of doing that is very, very dim. In a highly fractured multipolar world, it would be exceptionally difficult. And therefore, even the prospect of trying to change or modify the composition of the Security Council, which is the favorite talking point for amending the charter, it's just probably not going to happen. So faced with that, those impediments to change, Mark Ellis and I thought, well, we really should just look at the charter as it is right now. Just what does it look like? Because it looks like pretty much what it looked like in 1945, and almost exactly. And how do we interpret it now with our 2025 lens on? Because this is the document that is going to survive. It is the key document, and whether certain people, who are kind of cynics of the whole process like it or not, the UN Charter is not going anywhere. It's staying. It's just like the US Constitution. It's there. And we need to look at it sometimes without, just like we do the US Constitution, we don't necessarily try to interpret all of its clauses by thinking about 250 years of federal government dysfunctionality and disaster, and then kind of latch that onto the words of the US Constitution. Rather, sometimes the Constitution itself actually has the superior hand in the argument. And we need to understand that with the UN Charter too, that its wording actually does sometimes have very, very lasting effect. So I'm going to just race now and say, what are the 5 pillars for humankind? Well, 1, maintain international peace and security. That's what most people think about when they think about the Security Council, the UN. That's what usually makes the news. And when we look at the key clauses of the UN Charter on the issue of international peace and security, we always go to sort of 4 of them, or 3 or 4. Article 2, subparagraph 4, which is the one that says all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with purposes of the United Nations. Now, that might sort of sound like gobbledygook these days, but quite frankly, the interpretive challenge of those words today is enormous, because the multidimensional character of the use of force these days far exceeds what existed in 1945. You have not only conventional use of military forces, munitions, you have advanced weaponry, cyber warfare, disinformation, human-induced ecological catastrophes, viral outbreaks, energy blackouts, financial manipulations, space-based disruptors, waves of migrants shoved onto the sovereign territories of other countries. So that offers a tremendous amount of opportunity to say, okay, let's take Article 2.4 and understand what should be refrained from in the relations between states. It's not just the conventional warfare. It's much, much more than that today. Then Article 2, subparagraph 7, is probably the most significant interpretative puzzle of the Charter, because it prohibits the United Nations from intervening in, quote, matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. If any of you have ever traveled to China and sat down for a policy discussion with your Chinese counterparts, and you've touched upon international affairs, there will be an immediate use of Article 2.7 by your Chinese hosts, because for them, this is mantra. It basically says, don't interfere with us. And yet, as the world matures, certainly since 1945, what constitutes the internal affairs of a state and the domestic jurisdiction of any state is a very, very problematic proposition. The transborder realities of international trade, environmental phenomena, social media, human rights violations, expanding telecommunications, cyber attacks, irregular warfare, migrations, epidemics, pandemics, educational and cultural exchanges, all of that is not the exclusive domain of internal affairs. And so there's a lot to interpret there in that article for the future. And then finally, all of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, Articles 39 through 51, are about maintaining international peace and security. And there's some fascinating provisions in that article, including the mandatory use of force by the United Nations. In other words, the authority to insist that all states recognize that force will be used and will be used for a legitimate purpose under the authority of the United Nations. And there are examples of that in the last 80 years. But what I want to race forward to is to say that the final article of Chapter 7 is Article 51, which upholds, quote, the inherent right of any individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. Now, you bet that requires a modern interpretation, because what is an inherent right today, and what in the world is an armed attack today? And what latitude do nations have to invoke Article 51? Not really necessarily in any kind of totally, restrictive way, but frankly, the doors are sort of opening on Article 51 as to what does constitute an armed attack, and what under customary international law could be regarded as inherent rights. Now, the four other pillars of the Charter are human rights and fundamental freedoms, and so much could be spoken about that, but the UN Charter really is the foundation stone for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic and Social, for the creation and operation of the UN Human Rights Council. All of those treaties and institutions look to the UN Charter as basically their foundational premise. These are the foundational tenets of the Charter. And frankly, I would say without these human rights and fundamental freedoms principles that evoke equality and the values of each person's life and well-being on planet Earth, the UN Charter would be little more than an aging document of security pledges to preserve the sovereignty of nations. Now, the third pillar, and I'm almost finished, would be respect for international law. And people don't typically even think of the UN Charter in this context, but remember that the annex to the UN Charter is the statute of the International Court of Justice, the World Court, the UN's top court, which sits in The Hague. So international law is deeply tied into the UN Charter. References to its importance are referenced in the preamble to the UN Charter. And what we try to point out in the book is that international law has a key role to play in the future challenges that are confronting the United Nations. And we have a few suggestions about how to maybe create a couple of new UN oversight bodies that would emphasize the need to comply with international law and to monitor that compliance with international law each year by the member states. And then the fourth pillar is to promote economic and social progress. And here, we sort of try to make the point that the United Nations is not a vast commercial enterprise or a governing body responsible for the world's economic prosperity or social well-being among the countless cultures and peoples spanning the globe. Those primarily are the responsibilities of the private and government sectors of 193 sovereign nations. But part of the UN Charter maps out the goals that should be pursued in pursuit of normalcy in global society, in contrast to the disruptive character of hostilities and peace endeavors, and how they are to be managed. That characterizes many of these economic and social provisions in the Charter. And then finally, enable the peacekeepers as the final pillar of the UN Charter. If you read through the UN Charter, you can pick out certain articles, provisions of the Charter that suddenly strike you as, wait a minute, why aren't we pursuing this as a way to advance peace in the world? Why isn't the UN more active on this point? And I'll just point out, for example, Article 14 vests in the UN General Assembly the power to recommend measures for the peaceful adjustment of any situation, regardless of origin, for a wide range of situations in the world. It's pretty open-ended language. And the UN General Assembly does this occasionally, but what we try to point out in the book is, could we just put a power punch behind some of these articles? Could we read them, in a modern lens and just say, yeah, you've got power, use this power. Article 33, stresses that all member states should prioritize seeking peaceful resolutions to disputes. And it places initial responsibility on governments to do that. Article 34, the Security Council has the power to investigate emergent situations that might slide into international friction or give rise to a dispute. That power should be used. If you could ever get the permanent members of the Security Council on the same page again. And then Article 36 gives the Security Council ample authority and flexibility to steer parties toward peaceful settlement of disputes with all sorts of recommendations, procedures, etc. And you just don't see it happen that often. And then Article 38, the Security Council can press parties to a dispute with recommendations for peaceful settlements. And then finally, Article 99 gives the Secretary General of the UN the power to bring to attention of the Security Council any matter which is, in his opinion, may threaten the maintenance of international peace and security. That power has been rarely used by the Secretary General. If he uses it, he makes headlines. Why not do that occasionally? The last time it was used was by Secretary General Guterres, the current Secretary General, who in December 2023 gave notice to the Security Council about the situation in Gaza and basically said, perk up, deal with this. So anyway, we try to bring a lot of, there's a lot more in the book that tries to unearth, certain characteristics of charter provisions, and just sort of introduce the book as a platform upon which the younger generations can really look at this document again with some hope, indeed some optimism, as to what a lasting, global document can mean to the future fate of both the peoples of the world and planet Earth itself. So I know that's a little high flying in language, but I would just, it's why we were so enthused to write this book. So Daniel, I turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, David. That was really a great and impassioned presentation. It does seem in the US today that discussions of the UN rarely are infused with the sort of vision and positivity that was its motivating conception. Really briefly, in the Mary Robinson introduction, you mentioned that this reference to both principles and procedures.
Yeah.
So you outlined a couple of principles in the
Right.
5 pillars. Can you give us a sense of a specific procedure
Yeah.
that's outlined in the charter
Yeah.
that people could think about and reflect on
Sure.
that shows the positivity of and the value of the charter?
Exactly. And I think I'll just turn directly to chapter 7 of the charter, which is the enforcement chapter to maintain international peace and security, or restore it. There is a step-by-step procedure in chapter 7 that is supposed to be followed in order to deal with a situation that really does break down with violent armed conflict. Because there are procedures in Chapter 6 which deal about, well, wait a minute, before you get to violent conflict, here are some important things you should try to do. And I pointed out some of those at the very end of my remarks to try to get to a peaceful solution without, everything blowing up. But if it's going to blow up, you look at Chapter 7. And one of the unfortunate, let me just say, I think one of the unfortunate things about the UN Charter is that in Chapter 7, basically the attention to that chapter and the procedures under it stopped really with Article 42 of the chapter. But remember, it goes all the way to Article 51. There are lots of articles between Article 42 and 51, which are very procedural in character, but basically they try to provide for the collection of armed forces, land, sea, and air, in order to have a performative UN military presence in a tough situation to try to bring that situation under control. It's all premised, of course, on governments voluntarily entering into what we call Article 43 agreements with the United Nations to say, look, we've got some of our soldiers on standby. If you need them for a crisis, we've got them. And you can count on it. Put it in your logbook that, country X has these kinds of forces available, country Y, these kinds of forces. If that were to be carried out as the charter had envisioned, you'd actually have a very impressive contingency force that could go in immediately and deal with a very tough situation. Imagine if we had such a force now to deal with the situation in Darfur, Sudan, which is just an appalling breakdown of atrocities and of sheer violence. Now, let me just say, and I'll stop with this, Daniel, that one of the most interesting reads I ever had, literally, as well as part of my scholar side of me, was to read the days of debate. I think maybe it was just 2 days. I can't remember now. But it was years ago, reading the debate in the US Senate in July of 1945 on Article 43, because the issue was, can the United States possibly agree with this, that we would actually allocate or designate some of our forces ultimately to be available to this United Nations to do what? So you can just imagine that debate. But guess what? The senators overwhelmingly embraced the concept of Article 43. And of course, they then ratified the UN Charter 89-2. So it just shows you that there is potential there. And it would just be, I think, a great and constructive challenge for the future to try to activate the rest of Chapter 7 of the Charter. And I'm just going to close with this. I haven't talked at all about the chapters of the Charter that frankly can be totally eliminated now because they are of no further function. And that's basically the decolonization charter provisions of the Charter. If we were to amend the UN Charter, you could just snip out those chapters because the world has been decolonized. And so that was a huge challenge in the talks leading to the UN Charter. And it really wasn't dealt with until San Francisco, that there would be decolonization as an objective of the UN system. You can just imagine Winston Churchill, fidgeting with a cigar at this concept that, is he going to sign on to the destruction of the British Empire? He really didn't want to, but he needed America's support in the war, so Roosevelt tugged him along. Anyway, it's just one of anyway, it's just a point about the UN Charter that I think is extremely interesting.
Well, I have a concrete question, which is, to what degree could we use the charter as a reflective point for comparing the legality and the adherence to process in the first Gulf War,
Hmm.
as compared to the
Yes,
U.S.-led 2003 invasion of Iraq? That is to say, the
exactly.
use of
Yeah,
force in Iraq, but two very different
yeah.
situations,
Two
particularly as
very,
with our charter.
I'm sorry, Dan. Yeah, two very different situations. They're a perfect example, actually. For the Gulf War in 1990, 91, right?
Yep.
Uh, the United States under President H.W. Uh, George Bush, um, and remember, he had been the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under President Reagan. I think that's right, right? I think I recall that. Um, he uh, uh, he orchestrated the planning for the Gulf War by getting approval from the UN Security Council for the intervention that would liberate Kuwait from the Iraqi invasion in that year.
A clear violation of the charter, right?
Oh yeah, I mean everything was just clear. It was just obvious, and you'll it's always in August of 1990. There's that famous day when British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher basically told President Bush, "Look, you have no choice here. This has got to happen, and it's got to happen now. And so we're going to make this happen." So it was just, and those were sort of kind of emerging golden years right at the end of the Cold War and into some of the 1990s when I was working for Albright at the UN. When we could actually sit down with Russia and get things done as well as with China. And it was astonishing. It was so different from the the situation today where there's just so little ability to cooperate. Now jump forward, of course, to 2003 and the U.S. intervention, the British U.S. intervention into Iraq. And there you had a big split in the Security Council. France was not going to go along with it. Russia and China weren't going to go along with it. And so ultimately, Security Council approval was not obtained. And that led to a lot of legal debates that I won't even start to get into, except there's a movie. Oh, oh, shoot. Oh, well, I wish I could remember the movie, the recent one, with Keira Knightley in it, about the British situation, looking at the legality of that without a Security Council resolution, authorizing it under Chapter 7. And so, yeah, you can weigh those two, and the procedures were discussed in 2003. And yet ultimately, the United States and the United Kingdom walked away from the procedures
Mhm.
and just did it.
And it was widely viewed as illegitimate for those reasons by so many states around the world.
Exactly. And in fact, at one point, I think I think Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General of the UN at that time, I think he at some point he said something like, uh, "Well, the intervention might have been legitimate, but it was not legal." I mean, that's how he sort of played it.
So please, those in attendance, drop your questions in the Q&A box. We have a few here from Bruce Poggle. There's more than one, so I'm just going to put them together. And David, you can answer them the way you like.
Sure.
Um, so does the high volume flow of dangerous drugs connected to hundreds of thousands of U.S. deaths constitute an armed attack under Article 51? I'll give you, that's kind of a complicated technical question, but we'll move on to the next
Yeah.
one. Also from Bruce Poggle, a colleague of ours here at ASU, I think that most observers find UN peacekeeping operations to be mostly ineffective. What can be done to fix this problem? So let's just take those two. They're not exactly the same point, but
Right.
maybe you could respond.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, thanks so much, and it's great to have you join us today. Bruce is a great part of the ASU faculty, and I would say to your first question, um, I I mean, this is just a personal view. If I were to look at drug trafficking and say, does the United States have a basis under Article 51, an inherent right of individual self-defense to, I guess what you're suggesting, take the actions that we see have unfolded in the news over the last 2 months with respect to hitting these small boats, um, then I think it would be pretty clear from a lawyer's review of that that would not enter the spectrum of Article 51. And the administration isn't even trying to go there in their explanation of they're rather they're explaining it more in terms of U.S. law, the War Powers Resolution, and whether we're in hostilities or what have you, that whole debate. But I will just say that one has to be very careful here because in that whole situation that is unfolding, don't estimate the ability of there to be a challenge that ultimately would draw the United States into the International Court of Justice, the UN's top court, with respect to how armed forces being used in that part of the world. Now, there are some jurisdictional hurdles to doing that, but it's not as if this can all be done antiseptically. In other words, outside of the UN structure or the UN Charter structure or the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. And there's also, of course, the issue of the International Criminal Court. One has to remember that both Venezuela and Colombia are states parties to the International Criminal Court. So just imagine, what could unfold in these scenarios. As far as UN peacekeeping,
Could I step in for a second? That this is one of the issues
yeah,
that we see a lot in the US, which is to the degree these international bodies using procedures in the case of the ICJ that were outlined in the charter, um, to the degree those mechanisms are used in a way to say bring the US before the ICJ, that tends to diminish the power of the profile of the UN in the U.S. domestic politics. It certainly doesn't yield a response anything like how you described
yeah,
the FDR era, where there was an effort
sure,
to elevate the UN
yeah,
and its vision, and its purpose. It seems to have the exact opposite effect. How would
yeah.
you respond to all of that? I mean, it seems
Oh,
to
I would just say
pull away.
that I just think it's time, that we stop being so intimidated by something called the United Nations or the International Court of Justice or even the UN Charter. The United States is a very powerful country with a tremendous adherence. I mean, I will just say it, to the rule of law throughout its very tortured history, at least a commitment to the rule of law. And so I just don't think uh, it's just not it's not worth it to say, oh, we're so scared of this and we're so scared of that. Please, don't do this. Don't challenge us under international law on this point. We're strong enough to actually enter those debates and speak our principles and our values and our adherence to the rule of law. So I would just say that yeah, sure. I mean, if the United States has been taken to the International Court of Justice before, and
On
somehow
use
we
of force issues.
survived it. Yeah, on use of force issues. Nicaragua v. USA, 1980s. So it's happened, and it's not the end of the world, but it also shows that we have the credibility to actually enter the arena and defend ourselves. Um, on the issue of UN peacekeeping, Bruce, sure. I mean, a lot of peacekeeping operations are criticized for being ineffective, but I think everyone should recognize how difficult it is. You're asking military personnel under blue helmets, the UN flag, to all be brought together from various militaries around the world to make one peacekeeping force in, say, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and to operate unbelievably efficiently as one unit. And of course, that's very difficult to do, as you know. It would be easier if we had a sort of an Article 43 structure whereby there was a much longer lead time of making sure that the proper units existed with the proper skill sets, combat or otherwise, and we knew very coherently, hell, let's use artificial intelligence on it, very intelligently, how to bring all of these individuals together, men and women, in order to constitute a UN peacekeeping force. That being said, it's always important to understand that a peacekeeping force, in large part, is not there in order to engage in combat, although in recent years they've been given much greater latitude on self-defense grounds to use force if necessary in difficult situations and in humanitarian crises. But the fact is, if you're not there in a combat role, but rather in a sort of stabilizing role, then you're going to be whipsawed back and forth by all of these non-state groups that are fighting all around you, and state groups that are state militaries that are also intervening. So it gets very, very complicated, and the peacekeeping force is sort of pressed to achieve cooperation among all parties to minimize, if not stop, the fighting. And that is difficult. It's very difficult. So anyone who thinks, oh, we'll just send in a peacekeeping force and stability will automatically reign, that's just not going to happen. It's always going to be tense. And so, that's just the reality of peacekeeping.
Can you think of concrete cases where, whether it's a peacekeeping force or an ICJ decision or something that's closely bound to the innovations of the Charter, where you can step back and see, great success? Obviously, not all peacekeeping missions are successful, but maybe it
Yeah.
would be useful to ground, the debate in
Well,
something that really does look successful.
sure. I think the peacekeeping force in Cyprus, even though it's been there forever, since the early 1960s, it certainly has held firm on stabilizing the division of Cyprus from northern Cyprus, so that we haven't had an additional conflagration of armed force in that theater for a very, very long time. The criticism, of course, is that, well, wait a minute, what's this issue with a perpetual peacekeeping force? Well, in some situations, yeah, there has to be a perpetual peacekeeping force in order to stabilize the situation. And I'm just quickly racing around in my head in terms of perhaps a situation or two.
Or an ICJ case,
Here's
that's
another one. No. Here's another one that I would suggest, and that is the peacekeeping force in Cambodia in the early 1990s. It wasn't perfect, but the whole point of that peacekeeping force deployed in Cambodia was to transition Cambodia from a post-Pol Pot regime of authoritarianism to more of a democratic form of government, and a stable one, and one that would diminish the role of the Khmer Rouge. Now, it wasn't completely successful, and of course, Hun Sen became, sort of the new authoritarian leader of Cambodia, ultimately in the aftermath of that peacekeeping operation. But Cambodia remained relatively peaceful, with, of course, the exception of some flare-ups with Thailand over territorial disputes. But quite frankly, the International Court of Justice, stabilized that situation for some time with its own ruling on who possesses this temple along the border of Cambodia and Thailand, they finally decided, I think, that it should be on Cambodian, or considered to be on Cambodian territory. And that did stabilize things for a long time until, of course, earlier this year, there was a huge flare-up once again between those two countries. But the peacekeeping force has been long gone. It was there in the 1990s.
Question here from Jan Bennett, who's teaching a class on the UN, brought some students along.
Great.
In many parts of the world, like Western Sahara, South Ossetia, these territories remain under military occupation. And could the interpretation of the decolonization chapter in the UN Charter in today's world play a role in helping to resolve those situations, given that most of the classic decolonization stories that were present in 45 and not now have passed?
Right, but I think the question is suggesting that because we still have the Western Sahara problem, could the UN Charter still be relevant with respect to a territory like the Western Sahara, if I understand the question properly? And I think I'm not so sure. I mean, I think the principles of the UN Charter definitely are relevant with respect to the Western Sahara. It's just that institutionally, a territory like the Western Sahara has sort of, there's not a UN institutional basis to really tackle that situation anymore. I'm being very simplistic in saying that, but it's as if I'm not so sure I would look to, certainly, not the trusteeship provisions; those are over with in the UN Charter. There's the non-self-governing territories provisions. I think it's an excellent question, but I think I would fall back, if I were really to work this out in my mind, I would fall back on, well, what basic principles can one draw from those now rather defunct chapters of the UN Charter and apply them in the negotiating scenario that the Western Sahara still presents itself with? And by the way, I just read something recently. You've probably already discussed this with your students, but I thought I read something just within the last few days that the United States has introduced, I think, something in the Security Council to kind of move the Western Sahara closer towards Moroccan, sovereignty. I'm don't hold me to this, but I'm just saying that yes, the Western Sahara still remains a very hot subject.
An interesting question here, or comment from Craig Meyer. The cost factor of peacekeeping forces must be heavy, and I would just zoom out a little bit and just ask the question, to what degree are the rather large costs associated with lots of UN activities, to what degree are those cost effective, and how would we know?
Well, it's always so fascinating to get that question, because in a comparative sense, the cost of the UN system and its specialized agencies is rather minimal compared to the responsibilities that they have. And the expectations people have for them to solve all of these problems on a dime rather than a dollar. So I think it's kind of it's always, there's no way to avoid it. I mean, I worked on the staff of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the House in the late 80s, and the UN budget was a constant issue of how much would we pay, because the peacekeeping budget is very, very large, even compared to the regular budget of the UN. And recognize that so much of the UN is actually financed voluntarily by governments, not by assessment. And that by that I mean the specialized agencies and other operations of the UN, which are based upon voluntary contributions, for which the United States has often been the very largest donors. For example, for the World Food Program, the United States has I think almost consistently been the largest donor. That's changed this year, of course. But the point being that, you know, I think the way to examine the UN is, first of all, understand, well, what are the functions we need it to perform? What is the cost of those functions? And are we willing to pay that cost, or is the cost going to be the predominant decisive factor in whether or not we're supporting the UN or supporting this operation or not? Um, uh, you know, it's there. And by the way, the United States has, through a history of negotiations internally within the United Nations, we have been able to pare down our percentage that's owed to the United Nations, first, for the regular budget and for the peacekeeping budget. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, in the late 1990s, when he was our ambassador to the UN, he dove into that headfirst, along with Senator Helms of North Carolina, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time, and they got it done. They got it done, to the general agreement of the UN bureaucracy as well as the member states. But by depriving the United Nations of the funding that we actually owe it, we're obviously, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't deprive it of the funding and then complain that it's not achieving the functions that you want it to achieve.
What do you think? We're getting towards the end of time here, and I'm just curious. You have a real passion and personal engagement with the United Nations, and you want to draw attention to this foundational document that I would imagine, many people know next to nothing about. What is the strongest argument for sort of the ordinary American, or let's just say the undergraduate or graduate student, as to what they should know about the Charter and why they should view it as significant as you do?
Because most Americans truly do believe in the US Constitution, which includes, remember, all of its amendments, including the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, etc. They believe in that. And within the US Constitution are fundamental values of our society. Guess what? The UN Charter also reflects those fundamental values on a global scene, on a global stage. And so for me, it's not that hard a leap to say to someone who is very enthusiastic about the US Constitution, I like to just say to that person, well, let me invite you into this room. It's called the UN Charter, because I think it's going to resonate with you when you read the UN Charter as well. You're going to see what you believe in the US Constitution. You're going to see it reflected in the UN Charter. And guess what? The UN Charter was drafted with an enormously heavy US hand during World War II. So the drafters of the UN Charter knew that those values and the principles that you see in the UN Charter also derive from the American experience.
David Scheffer, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and have a very good night.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.